Welcome, everyone. My name is Leo de Haan. I'm rector of ISS, and I welcome you to our 60th anniversary. 60 years of development studies, 60 years of training students, doing development research, and more than that. Perhaps you've seen above the main entrance this title from Palace to Post Office. We were established in the Paleis Noordeinde, and then the Queen needed it for her office. And so we moved to the Grand Hotel in Scheveningen, the Wittebrug. And then some 20 years ago, we landed here in the, what was then the headquarters of the Dutch Postal Services. Not the post office, but almost the post office. That is why, from palace to post office. But still, 60 years of development studies, of training students from the global south, doing development research, but always connecting it with development practice and aiming at making a difference. I think that is the crux of what ISS is and was. And so also constituting a platform for debate, feeding into policies, development policies, trying to open up for new ideas, trying to engage with development practitioners, policymakers. And that is precisely what we are going to do this afternoon. In the Netherlands, and not only in the Netherlands, there are fierce debates at the moment what should happen with international development cooperation. And this panel and this symposium this afternoon wants to focus on that discussion, wants to contribute to that. And so I wish you a very interesting afternoon, and I'll hand over to the chair of this afternoon, Professor Rob van der Hoeven.
Thank you very much, Leo, and indeed, welcome to this anniversary of the ISS. And we thought to give credence to your anniversary, you don't look only backwards, but you also look forwards. And so we thought it would be opportune to organize a forum on the post-2015 agenda. It's still in front of us. It will have new challenges, and we're very happy that so many of you have been coming here to attend this forum. The forum is also an experiment because we're not only going to talk with people here, but we're also going to talk with people outside this room, namely our graduates of the ISS. They will also be involved in this activity, so that is also then a bit looking to the past, but they can then also give again their opinion on the future. How are we going to organize the forum? We have 2 hours. And not more than 2 hours, because around you you see a lot of paintings, and at 5 o'clock we will have an opening here of an art exhibition, and also in the same time a reception. So we will squeeze between science, politics and arts, but we'll try to make that in 2 hours. How are we going to organize the forum? We will first have presentations from our guests. Our first guest will be Professor Rob Vos, who is head of the DESA and Director of Development Policies and Analysis Division in DESA, New York. And more importantly, he's also coordinator of the United Nations Secretary General System-Wide Task Force on the post-2015 UN Development Agenda. Then we will have a presentation by Professor Kannan, who is the former director and fellow of the Center of Development Studies in Trivandrum in Kerala. And both Rob Vos, associated with ISS, Professor Kannan is the first PhD graduate of ISS, also very close to ISS, but bringing views from abroad. Then we have a first reaction from our graduates in the field. We will have first Mrs. Silvia Hernandez, Deputy Minister of National Planning and Economic Policy in Costa Rica. Then Professor José Antonio Pereña, Professor of Economics and Dean of the PhD Program in Development Studies. And then Mr. Davidar, the Chennai Development Commissioner. And then we'll have a reaction by Mr. Koen Davidse, who is the Director of Multilateral Organization and Human Rights of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. And then we have a public discussion. But before we do that, I'll give the floor to Will Hout to give a short introduction about the history of this forum and also how we're going to interact with the field in this forum. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Very brief introduction, otherwise we keep on introducing while we're not going to get the beef. Indeed, as Rolf has already said, we feel that the discussion on the post-2015 agenda is very timely. We all know that some 12 years ago there was an agreement on the so-called Millennium Development Goals, and that the grand phrase is always the world community organized to make poverty history. Now we're 12 years down the road, and most of the targets of the Millennium Development Goals specify that certain achievements should be there by 2015. There's a lot of debate about, are we going to make that? Well, we know that for a lot of countries and for a lot of these targets we're not going to make it. But in any case, the more important point of discussion for us as development studies scholars and practitioners is, okay, if we arrive in 2015, what should we do then? Should we just renew the Millennium Development Goals, set new targets, maybe for 2030, or should we take a different approach? Now that latter question, should we take a different approach, has been the starting point for our thinking on organizing this debate today. And we're very pleased to have these experienced panel members. Of course, you see behind the table, which is not planning, it's just a coincidence, all men. We would have wished that to be different, but okay, that's how it is. On the part of the organizing committee, I'd like to say very great thank you to all of you who've shown up, and we hope that you will all participate in the debate. Indeed, we will have some speeches. We've asked the panelists to do that concisely, 15 to 20 minutes. And then we have 3 videos on 3 different questions related to the Millennium Development Goals. And we've invited several of our alumni to comment on those questions. So it will be a back and forth from here, the lectern, to the screen where we will show the short videos. Thank you.
Thank you, Will Hout. So no more introductions, and I ask Rob Vos to take the floor to give us a view from New York and what is the latest in New York on the new development, the post-2015 development agenda. Rob, you have the floor.
Okay, thank you, Rector and Rolf and Will, for organizing this. It's good to be back here at the ISS, see so many friends and former colleagues, I would say not former, but still colleagues here at ISS. Let me start by saying happy birthday, ISS. Almost as old as the United Nations, but not quite. And hope that will be a long time of ISS further and also helping shape the future development agenda. What I'm going to do is to answer 2 of the questions which Will raised in the beginning. So we have a development agenda. Was it any good, and do we need a new one? And if we need a new one, should it be a different one than the one we've had? So take you through those questions based on a report. If you haven't seen it, I suggest you download it. It's not being printed except for this one, but it's available from the website, which is a report produced by 60 UN entities and agencies, including the IMF, the World Bank, for those that don't know, they're part of the UN system, and also the WTO, which we've engaged in it, although it's not a UN agency. But so you can imagine if you have 60 UN agencies put together to think about these issues, that's as bad as putting 60 economists in a room. Probably worse, because you get so many different opinions of what should be done. But by some miracle, we found a common ground to think about the future of the development agenda. So let me, since I only have 20 minutes, take you through some headlines of what the thinking is at this point and where we go from here as far as the UN is concerned. So maybe a good starting point is, in answering the question, do we need one, is what has the existing agenda brought us? Now, asking that to a UN bureaucrat like me, it's like asking the president of the European Central Bank, is the euro a good thing or not? Because, well, it's his bread and butter, so he would never say it's a bad thing. So, of course, we've worked a lot over the years, over the past 12 years with the MDG agenda, or the agenda based on the Millennium Declaration. And the common vision is that that agenda has brought a lot of good in the sense of rallying a lot of views and support around a development agenda that's human-centered, centered around human development. And it's also rallied at the national levels and at international levels support for that kind of agenda. And we haven't seen that in the past around such a broad agenda. And even more so around an agenda which has an impossible acronym, MDGs, right? And that, as said, and in many parts of the world, it's an acronym that people understand what it means. So those are the important aspects. We'll refer to have we achieved these targets and goals. According to our latest estimates, globally, we probably have reached 3 of the goals already, or the targets, I would say, already before 2015. That's halving global poverty. It's improving access to drinking water, as the target was set, and improving the livelihoods of people living in urban slums. And also, on average, more or less, we've achieved gender equality in education. That doesn't mean all is good. It's been a very uneven process. In terms of a global agenda, we've moved forward. Now, critics would say, well, is this because of the MDG agenda or something else? It's hard to prove that point because we don't know what the situation would have been without the agenda. But the general sense is that, and also working on the ground, that in a lot of places it has helped give a lot more focus to the development agenda at human development issues rather than what was, when the development agenda was established, the mainstream vision of development, which was the Washington Consensus, basically looking at trickle-down philosophies, economic growth, economic stabilization, and economic liberalization that would bring development. And I think the MDG agenda helped to change, at least in part, that focus of the international policy agenda. Of course, there's all kinds of issues with critiques that it hasn't worked. Maybe the target setting always has been correct. There's been critiques that it's just an agenda of goals and targets, doesn't say anything about the means. Now, some people say that's the strength of the agenda, others say it's a weakness. But some people say it didn't really fully address the structural causes of poverty and exclusion in development around the world. And most importantly, people have come to focus on maybe some important aspects were left out of the agenda, particularly not enough attention to sustainable development issues, environmental sustainability, issues of peace and conflict. We know that in none of the countries that are in conflict or are categorized as fragile states, nowhere near is there achievement towards the, any of the MDG goals. So that's an important issue, and a number of other issues that come to the fore. But in a nutshell, the bottom line is that the UN system feels that the MDG agenda as such has given enough value added to think through and to think that a common and overarching agenda that is coordinated internationally is a useful thing to have and brings value added despite its shortcomings. Then, so a further question is, do we really need one? Well, actually, a lot of the issues that were already there 12 years ago have become much more pressing as we've moved forward. I've already mentioned issues of peace and security that's endangering the development agenda and its achievement in many places of the world. We have persistent inequalities. Of course, environmental sustainability has become a much more pressing issue in the minds of people at the moment, and it's impossible to think through a development agenda that doesn't put as a key part in the equation environmental sustainability, because without it, development is not possible. We have the knowledge challenge, we have demographic changes which are critical, and we have recurrent problems with food insecurity, and in the report the list is longer. So I won't dwell on these challenges, but just emphasize the key point that the report makes and why we need a new, possibly also an agenda with a different perspective, is that all these issues are interconnected through globalization processes, through various connections at different fronts. And also what the message they bring us is that business as usual is not an option. It's not like we can have a poverty agenda which is on top of existing agendas without changing the ways we produce, the ways we consume, the ways we do things together. Because to stay within environmental limits, to deal with these big challenges that are global challenges, things will have to be changed. So we need a different perspective on the agenda which is broader than the MDG agenda as we know it. So that's the key part of the message of should it be different. So we should bring in to the vision the interconnectedness of these problems, and particularly widen the scope to include more prominently sustainable development. It's not that it was excluded from the MDG agenda, but bring it much more to the center next to human development, but also without bringing into the agenda the entire work of the UN, like human rights and peace and security, but yes, to make clear that without addressing security and human security issues, it will be impossible in many parts of the world to fulfill a human and sustainable development agenda. Having said that, a lot of the key characteristics of the present agenda could be retained. What has been very successful, I think, is the focus on very concrete, time-bound goals and targets that make the stakeholders in the whole process much more accountable than any of the previous agendas that we've seen. We should also possibly say a little bit more about strategies and how to get there. And I'll come back to that in a minute. And we need probably to make sure that we set very clear global goals, the things that the world community should do together, while leaving enough space at the national level. So one of the misinterpretations of the MDG agenda as it came about is that all these goals and targets to be achieved by 2015 should be mathematically exactly achieved by each and every country in the world. Originally, that was never meant to be like that. There were global targets to be achieved, leaving space at the national level to set their own priorities within their given mean, as long as at the global level we would move into that direction. Of course, to strengthen accountability, and the UN as a system has been guilty in part of that, it has been said, well, maybe it makes it more concrete if at the national level we keep those same targets to be achieved by 2015. But in the original formulation, if you read back the original documents that founded that agenda, it was not meant to be like that. So maybe also to retain high degrees of ownership at the national level with national and local actors to engage in that agenda, it will be very important to leave enough space for target setting at the national level while meeting global goals. So what did we come up with? To disappoint you if you think, well, I'm going to tell you what the agenda is going to look like. I won't. I will just give you some contours of what the agenda might look like. We think there needs to be a long enough consultative process to establish the agenda and to make sure that it doesn't become a technocratic or an academic exercise by which we try to set perfectly the best kind of goals and targets in a appropriate setting, but it should also be realistic against what people feel that can be done, as much as should be ambitious as what should be done. And that has to be done in consultation. I'll finish with some words about the consultation process that we move forward. But very quickly, what does the proposed framework as we have laid it out now, how could it look like? We think it could center around 3 fundamental principles that would guide the overall framing of the agenda, which would be respect for human rights, equality, and sustainability, and then organize goals and targets around 4 dimensions: inclusive economic development, inclusive social development, environmental sustainability, and peace and human security. To bring these together, but see them as a holistic set of dimensions that have strong interactions amongst them. So what could that look like? In the report, we spelled it out, and you may not be able to see all these small letters here, but this has, in each of the bubbles, these 4 dimensions, with some hints at what the goals within each area could look like and in which area we could develop them. So in environmental sustainability, it would be to preserve biodiversity, to preserve a stable climate, and have sustainable natural resource management, as well as to contain natural hazards. In inclusive economic development, we, of course, there's to reduce poverty, create enough decent employment, and so on. In inclusive social development, to ensure that both at the bottom end and at the higher end, that we preserve minimum living standards, both for the poorest, but also for aging population and the elderly in the richer countries as we move forward. And a set of conditions and goals, maybe translated into goals, that would define the degree of security we want to move towards to make all these other 3 dimensions possible. Now, in order to speak about something about the means, what we say, you don't want to be prescriptive in telling countries and all the agents how exactly these goals should be perceived, but we could frame the issues in terms of enablers that could guide policy making. And from all of what is said is that policy making will have to be much more coherent across various areas, because economic policy making, social policy making, environmental policies, and preservation of peace and security. And that demands a lot more from governments at the national and the international level. So we may need much stronger principles that would guide towards that policy coherence. So these development enablers, without translating them in commanding policies, rather would set the principles of how things could be put together and also could be made coherent. So in the framework, we spell some of these out, and I don't have time to detail all of them. But think of, for instance, in the area of food security and eradicating hunger, it's not just about producing more food. It's about dealing with the inequalities in food distribution system. It's about producing food in more sustainable ways and set the goals and targets accordingly. So within that framework, so if you spell out conditions for sustainable food security, would then be the guiding principles both for actions that lead to poverty reduction and eradication of hunger, as much as into improving food systems at national and at the global through the global value chains that are actually sustainable, so that you also will stay within the sustainable and environmental limits. So that's kind of principles setting we're trying to move forward. So in moving forward, what further needs to be done? As I said in the beginning, we'd like the process to move forward in broad consultative processes that are underway. So the United Nations Development Group is organizing probably around, we'll end up organizing about 100 national level consultations. There will be regional level thematic consultation with a broad set of stakeholders to engage in the discussions, starting from this framework and other issues that they may bring in. And those, the outcomes of those consultations will be brought back into the discussion in New York at the level of the General Assembly. The Secretary General has also appointed a high-level panel of 26 members from leaders of government. It's co-chaired by the President of Indonesia and Liberia and the Prime Minister of the UK, but otherwise has experts from the civil society, from the business community, from academia, and other parts of the broader society. And what they are supposed to be doing is to inform the Secretary General, give advice on what would be the basis for political, the broad political consensus around the future development agenda. And in doing so, what we hope will happen in this process is that we avoid three things. One is to overload the agenda. As I said, we had 60 UN agencies. You can imagine that, each having their own work, so easily we could have 60 times an X number of goals and targets for each agency, and of course that would be ending up to the Christmas tree of things. So we need to avoid this overloading and have a clear focus, and hopefully the framework helps to do that. Not to be overtly prescriptive or too vague in the definition of the agenda, then we would also miss the point, or we should also avoid the current agenda, which by many is seen to be as a donor-centric agenda, rather than one with equal partners that collectively and together work as development partners towards the goals. Particularly if you take MDG-8, the goal for the global partnerships for development, particularly that goal is basically framed in terms of, do we provide enough development assistance to developing countries in order to help them achieve the development goals, where there's other dimensions, but like in trade and in debt relief and so on, that are also part of that agenda, which have received much less attention. But with the new agenda, we have to be much broader than that. It's about responsibilities, not just for developing countries, but for all countries. And it will be a challenge to redefine the global partnership along those lines. But clearly, we should avoid the agenda becoming another donor-centric agenda, given the challenges ahead. Okay, let me skip the slide, but basically saying, ending with two things. One is, given the transformative changes where I started out with that we think are needed for the new agenda to guide us towards a process of global development that is sustainable, that is equitable, and that is respecting in full human rights, that will take time to achieve. So we probably need a long-term agenda which may be adjusted over time as we move forward to see what works and what not works. And maybe then within that it will be important to set intermediate goals to hold each other accountable for what we're doing. Of course, this long time horizon is set with a lot of self-interest, because defining a long-term agenda will give us a lot of work for the future, but maybe that applies equally to the ISS moving forward. Finally, in the way forward, the report called Realizing the Future We Want for All, that was done on purpose. If people that are aware of the Rio +20 conference on sustainable development took place in June, which was about particularly environmental sustainability, but discussed a lot of the same territory as we have here, which was labeled, and that's what member states agreed on, the future we want. Here we've made it the future we want for all, and particularly emphasize realizing the future we want for all, because we want it to be an action-oriented agenda. The important thing that came out also of that conference was that the United Nations member states agreed to elaborate something they called Sustainable Development Goals. So of course after that was agreed, that created a lot of confusion. So what's the difference between the Sustainable Development Goals and whatever comes out of the post-2015 agenda? So when that confusion was created, then they said, no, we have to align that discussion and the formulation of those goals very closely with the post-2015 agenda. And I think conceptually they clearly overlap, and what I've presented here in the 4 dimensions, 3 of them fully overlap with the Sustainable Development Goals, and we're working now hard to make sure that it becomes one agenda, because one agenda is more than enough for the world to handle. So there's much more to say, but let me stop here because Rolf is getting very nervous.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Rob. Lots of food for thought, but keep your questions. We have a long session on questions after the presentation, and I'd like to give the floor straight away to Professor Kannan, who gives us a view from the south.
Thank you. I don't know how to address the chairman of the session today as Mr. Chairman or Rolf. Rolf is a friend, and it so happened both of us, or I happened to be in the team where we worked for the World Commission on the social dimension of globalization in ILO. And we often wonder what happened to that report. It's called For a Fair Globalization. But Rolf, thank you. And secondly, actually, firstly, I should thank the ISS and the rector, Professor Leo Dan, and the team of people here for remembering to invite somebody like me, well, whose distinction in this function is because I happen to be the first PhD. That's not something that I acquired, it just happened. But, but I'm very happy to be back. And still see many friends and teachers and a lot of other friends in the administration, although time has flown quite a bit. I want to make a particular mention of my guru, Professor Jan Bremen, with whom I still continue to work. And of course, friends who are here, Professor Martin Donbos, Vicky Mayers, Professor Ashwini Seth, who just informed me that he is not in a position to come due to some other personal reasons, and a whole lot of other people whom I still can recognize after 30 years. But let me straight go to the subject, since I'm sure he has to keep the time. When I was invited by Professor Wilhelm and also Professor Rolf, I was asking myself, oh my God, development, what's it? What are we going to talk about? I hear all the time we read about globalization, liberalization, the crisis in Syria, the crisis in Iran, the crisis in all parts of the world. And nobody is talking about development. Now here ISS comes and says, let's discuss about development 2015. That's also interesting, 2015, what is going to happen? Well, then I found out, of course, there is a reason for that. That's the time when the Millennium Development Goals, the current Millennium Development Goals is going to end, and the United Nations system is thinking of what needs to be done, and I think Professor Vos has very interestingly and I think inspiringly elaborated the new agenda. But as an academic, let me ask myself some questions which might be uncomfortable to me and to you, to everybody else. But I think that's the duty of academics, isn't it? If we don't raise difficult and uncomfortable questions, and what are we paid for? So let me start with this. To be on time, I prepared some notes, so I'll consult that, but I will also deviate if time permits. Much of the discussions on international development issues have been focused for quite some time on attaining the goals of MD, Millennium Development, MDGs for short. In my view, a highly restricted, minimalist agenda in a world which has increased its wealth and income substantially since the Second World War. The framework for this restrictive agenda is the Millennium Declaration signed by heads of states and governments of 189 member countries of the United Nations in 2000. The MDG was not a part of the declaration, but later framed at the initiative of the Western countries, but principally through the initiatives of OECD and the World Bank. Many have welcomed it, but many have criticized it as an apologia for the still powerful, if considerably weakened in credibility, of the neoliberal economic agenda based on what we call liberalization, privatization, and globalization. Simply LPG truly reflecting its inflammable character, and we know that. The current assessment seems to be that the progress in achieving the MDGs has mostly been in halving extreme poverty, defined in the international way, 1.25, I think the revised 1.25 PPP dollars per day per capita. There's extreme poverty. So the target is not to reduce poverty, reduce extreme poverty. And there is a long way to go in achieving the other 7 goals. Even the achievement in reducing extreme poverty is due to the performance of large emerging economies, mainly China, but also to some extent India. I am one of those who would be ill at ease if we were to reduce the international development agenda to the MDGs. As Richard Jolly has recently pointed out in one of his articles, that the UN played an incredible role in widening the conceptual and analytical foundations of development as well as its operational content. And you know about the Intellectual History Project of the United Nations. And interestingly, one of the principal authors of that is Professor Louis Emery, who was the rector when I was a student here, and whose book, along with Richard Jolly, Ahead of the Curve, I think it's a fascinating summary of the intellectual legacy of the United Nations of those days. While the human development paradigm is an overarching one, because that was introduced a little later, it was already there in the 1950s UN agenda, sufficient attention was also given later to specifics such as gender empowerment, environmental concerns, human rights, peace, and security, about which Professor Vos has already told us. I am sure there would be many who would like to see the MDGs expanded. I am not against MDG per se. Right? It's a very desirable goal to reduce many of the ills of people in many countries. What's wrong about it? But it's the larger picture, I think, that worries us. And implemented more vigorously in a post-2015 scenario than before. But when we discuss the development agenda for the future, I think it is imperative that we go beyond the MDGs and pay realistic attention to the international political economy. I think academic scholars have a duty to raise relevant questions and issues, however uncomfortable they are to the powers that be. I feel quite distressed as a student of development studies, as well as a concerned citizen, that the MDGs stand in disjunction to the reality of international politics and its concomitant power equations. Extreme poverty is sought to be halved, but not poverty that has a higher threshold value in terms of income. But this exhortation is in the midst of the imposition of neoliberal agenda on most countries, resulting in a slowing down of income growth as in Latin America, or a negative growth as in much of Africa. Just look at the report that I just mentioned. A few countries in Asia, especially the large ones, were of course exceptions. The Asian growth story is an exception in this era of globalization. Achievement of other goals requires directed interventions, including the allocation of national budgets, but the pressure from the Bretton Woods institutions was for fiscal consolidation that often resulted in cutting down the allocations for the social sector. Now, that of course is not just a story that affects only the developing countries now, that you also know what it is when the governments cut their expenditure on social sector or welfare expenditure heads. But let's ask, is money the main problem at the national and international level for achieving development targets as we have put out in the MDGs or in a reformed MDG? Look at the spending on military at the global and national levels. A 7% saving on world military expenditure will double the current ODA level, overseas development assistance level, of what I got 127 billion in 2009, and maybe it might have increased by now, but doesn't matter, a few hundred or a few tens of billions. Or let's take some specific comparisons. And that, I think, is the crux where you want to link poverty reduction with peace and conflict. To give you one example, because there are several organizations who are now exposing the consequences of increased military expenditure and what it means to international poverty. Just to give you a couple of examples, one B-2 stealth bomber costs, I'm told, $1 billion, US dollars. One bomber costs $1 billion US dollars. Equivalent to 2 full meals a day for 3.5 million starving people for a whole year. Or take the cost of a single aircraft carrier. I don't know what class would be that. I'm told there are several classes of aircraft carriers, just as we have several caste systems. So you have the military caste system, you have the high class carriers and the low class one. This must be fairly a medium class, I suppose. And that was quoted at $2.8 billion, one aircraft carrier. That is equivalent to giving 2 full meals a day for close to 10 million starving people for a whole year. Overseas development assistance totals hardly, or the overseas development assistance, the aggregate figure, I mean, they hardly convey the reality of actual receipts. So when we say we increase the ODA, then we automatically assume that increased ODA will also be spent there on development. Many developing countries and poor countries complain that much of it goes back to the donor countries. Others have pointed out that those deserve are not the ones who receive the most attention. I lived and worked in Cambodia to set up a research institution there in 95, 97 after the peace agreement. And we had a lot of contacts with the Cambodian officials. And the Cambodian finance minister, planning minister told me in one of the meetings that we get 15% of the development assistance that is spent here. So they get 15%. So you can imagine, and this is not, he was not, I'm not an official, I'm not, we became friends in conferences and all that. So he was sharing that this is what we get. Although the commitment, you will read $300 million, $400 million for Cambodia, we ultimately get 15%. Now, on the per capita distribution, even if you assume that these are all going to the people whom it is meant for, just for the sake of argument, in 2009, Western Asia, and that includes Egypt, all the other Middle East countries, and they are by no means the poorest countries in this world, they got about $46 on a per capita basis, whereas South Asia got just below $9. Now, this is somewhat recent figure. I had worked on this for a team in ESCAP for about 10 years ago. Then I ranked countries according to the per capita ODA they'd received the #1 country was Israel, the #2 was Egypt, and the rest follows. So I don't have to tell you more. Even this skewed distribution of ODA is not the end of the story. The reality is that developing countries are paying more to the rich countries than what they get. What we call in economics a negative flow of resources. And to cite an example, this I worked out from the UNCTAD Statistics Yearbook. In 2009, the debt service of the developing countries was $352 billion US, as against an ODA receipt to the developing countries of $120 billion US. That is, for every $1 of ODA received, they paid close to $3 as debt service. So you can imagine what would be the impact of ODA if countries were positioned in such dire situations. Does this convey any message of the impact of ODA and non-attainment of many of the MDGs? Globalization means easier movement of capital, raw material, products and services, but not people. Yet, with all the restrictions on movement, workers' remittances to developing countries amounted to $83 billion in 2009, with transition economies accounting for another $24 billion. But another $184 billion to developed countries. What this suggests is that everybody benefits by workers' remittance, with a bigger share going to the richer countries, because richer countries share more of their highly skilled, educated professionals abroad, and therefore they send back, they earn more money. That's as simple as that. So it's an international agenda which works to the benefit of everybody, more to the benefit of countries with much better human educational and skills capabilities. And yet, movement of people is an intractable or an unacceptable agenda in international trade negotiations. Okay, one more minute? Fine, thank you. The entire spectrum of international negotiations that have to do with development is, in my opinion, in crisis. Look at the Rio minus 20, and the inability to arrive at any agreement on carbon emissions. Read this along with the refusal of the most powerful economically and military country refusing to abide by such international agreements as the Kyoto Protocol or the Law of the Sea. WTO negotiations are at an impasse, the Doha round. Agriculture is a no-go area for the rich countries, as in the case of movement of people. Peace and security is now conspicuous by its absence in most countries. What meaning one can attach to development agenda or policy when regimes are sought to be changed by military forces, while some other regimes with the worst record of human or gender rights are protected by the very same military force? When poorer countries in Africa are subjected to predatory exploitation of their natural resources by multinational corporations, with the connivance of ruling elites in those countries, what is the relevance of MDGs for the people there? How much leeway many poor countries have in setting national development strategies and policies when they have to borrow from the Bretton Woods institutions? Given the crisis of neoliberal economic policy regimes, and I don't have to talk about this in Europe now, how much concern one can expect on the agenda of development? Who is talking about, or which public is now worried about development, development policy, development assistance? Are people in richer countries worried about development in poorer countries, or about keeping their employment and social security? The inclusion of equality in the Millennium Declaration is indeed a welcome one. In the Millennium Declaration, not in the MDG. But what is the record on this front? Has inequality increased or decreased? I do not have to give an answer to this august body. The ILO has been warning on the consequences of globalization and its concomitant liberalization on employment. And interestingly, while I agree with Professor Vos, many of the future agenda, employment is conspicuous by its omission. The employed are threatened with loss of their jobs, while the first-time job seekers, even in rich countries, face the prospect of prolonged unemployment. Open unemployment in poor countries may be less, going by their statistics, but the problem is that of working poor and informalization of jobs in a context of pre-existing informal economy. I would not compare the crisis in the richer societies with that of the poorer ones, certainly not, even in terms of employment and social security. They are at vastly different levels of standard of living and economic capacity, and yet there is a crisis of confidence. There is an impasse as far as economic policy package is concerned. Socialism as we knew has more or less faded from the globe, and capitalism as we knew is prone to one crisis after another, but always threatening the less rich and the poor. It is in such a context that the future development approach has to be placed, as the last point, Rolf, and then understood before setting an agenda. If at all an agenda has to be drawn up, it will be inequality that should get far more serious attention than mere poverty reduction in an absolute sense, using an abysmally minimal threshold. People don't say I am poor or in an absolute sense. If you have more, then I feel I am poor, irrespective of what I have got. So inequality as a major problem. Employment will have to be central in such an agenda because that alone gives and restores human dignity, in which socialized social security will have to be an integral part. National sovereignty will have to be respected, and the UN should come forward with assistance for strengthening national development strategies that are compatible with cultural, environmental, and gender dimensions. If the policy approach and agenda fails to elicit enthusiasm and participation from the developing countries, it will have just less legitimacy. There should be a demand for a new development agenda from those who have to have it. Finance is not something to be ignored, but not something to be privileged over other dimensions. A greater degree of research and dissemination will have to be undertaken on a partnership basis. Civil society organizations, academic and scholarly institutions, and public intellectuals, especially those who have a greater commitment to the principles of Millennium Declaration, that is freedom, equality, solidarity, tolerance, respect for nature, and shared responsibility. This is the Millennium Declaration signed by 189 countries. Should be recognized as legitimate stakeholders. Just because you are not in the government doesn't mean you are not a stakeholder. The UN should strive to create an enabling environment for them to play a more active role in bringing about a greater degree of understanding among the peoples. I think the time has come to abandon pretensions and be more ambitious in moving towards a more nuanced understanding of the problems facing countries and peoples. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Professor Kannan. I think we have some nice subjects for discussion later on, but still hold your fire. Maybe it's fired up more even after this discussion, because now we're going to look abroad, and Will is going to guide us in that. Go ahead, Will.
Yes, well, one of the major assets of an institute like this, particularly with almost 60 years of history, is, of course, the alumni. The ISS is well underway to getting 12,000 alumni, and we thought it a good idea to also include them in this afternoon. Of course, we have Professor Kannan, who is also an alumnus, but we wanted to share more thoughts with you, and we invited 3 of our alumni, and Rolf has already mentioned them, to comment on 3 questions. We've made short videos of about 4 minutes with their inputs, and we hope that that can also provide an input into the discussion this afternoon. So these are a Vice Minister of National Planning and Economic Policy in Costa Rica, Silvia Hernandez, who did her MA in Development Studies in 2003-2004. It's the Director of the Chennai Corporation in Chennai, India, Wilfred Davida, who did his Master's in Development Studies in 2005-2006, and it's Professor José Pereirinha, who's currently the Vice President for Scientific Affairs at the Technical University of Lisbon in Portugal and Professor of Development Studies, PhD from 1984 till 1988, the second PhD alumnus. So in time, I mean. So he was after Kannan. So this is the first question. What do you think of the MDGs? And we hope that technology won't forsake us.
Regarding the MDGs, they have always been incorporated into the national development plans, and tasks are performed periodically to monitor their compliance.
Results are good in some indicators, but are less successful in others. It is questionable if bad results are due to a bad national strategy or to exogenous factors. The recent global financial crisis and its negative effect on international trade is one of them.
The fact that we had the goals was something that we could look forward to, and we were looking forward to it and working towards it. So there is a necessity to have something that is goal-oriented. We may have differences of opinion with some of the goals being more specific than the other, more attainable than the others, but we do need goals of some kind. We also need a timeline, because in the bureaucracy or in government or in public policy for that matter, if there is no timeline, there is a danger of not getting anywhere at all.
If we look at the overall results, the country has pretty much achieved all the goals. However, it is until very recently that we made progress in identifying the MDGs disaggregated to a local territorial level. This evidence the progress and setbacks in the different areas of the country, allowing focus and target state intervention policies towards meeting the goals. There are still some territories where achievement of this goal will be very critical and in some cases even impossible.
In the case of Portugal, Portugal is a country member of the European Union and of the Eurozone, which means that the policy agenda is framed by the European Union so that this comment does not exactly apply to Portugal. But the Millennium Development Goals are included in some strategic orientation of this country. One of them is National Strategy for Sustainable Development. The other is the Strategic Vision for Portuguese Development Cooperation. In the latter, the Millennium Development Goals are considered by the government as a guide for action in the official development assistance.
The danger, of course, in having MDGs is that everyone focuses on the goals at the conference level, but not at the administrative level. And when I look at it in the administrative level, I come down to brass tacks, then I realize that there can be policy which need not be implemented.
You close now? Yeah. Sorry, we exercised this 70 times, but so now we invite Koen Davidse, the head of multilateral corporations and human rights of the Dutch ministry, to give some reactions. Koen, you have the floor.
Well, thank you very much, and also my turn to say happy birthday, ISS. I myself experienced that ISS can really give you friends in high places. In the 90s, I was working in South Asia, and there was a new government in Nepal, and I was visiting Kathmandu, and I was delighted to see that everybody wanted to receive me and not all the other people in the diplomatic corps, because more than half of the ministers had some experience following courses here at the ISS. So it's good to keep in touch with you, and who knows, it might open doors somewhere, someplace. A lot has been said already, and I think some of the things I say will be similar to what people said before, and some of them, of course, will not be so similar. The current MDG framework has served us well and is still serving us well. It's been the main international guideline for Dutch development policy in recent years, and progress has indeed been made. If you see the cover of the Dutch paper Volkskrant this morning, it had a very optimistic tone saying that fewer people are hungry than thought. Unfortunately, they still mentioned 870 million people that are hungry, so we still have quite a challenge to go. Dutch development policy has focused in particular on gaps. We focused on the MDGs that have seen relatively little progress, such as maternal health and sexual and reproductive health and rights. Too many women still die in preventable childbirth deaths, and sexual and reproductive health and rights are still not assured. I remember from my days working on Sudan the horrible statistics that UNICEF published of estimating that 26,000 women die in childbirth-related complications in both Sudans every year, which is more than twice the number in Latin America. Fragile states were also a focus of Dutch policy because this is where, of course, the MDGs are hardly attained. I'll come back to that. And crucial development issues on which the Netherlands has special expertise, such as water and food security and nutrition, were also a focus of our policy. The Dutch government has consistently invested 0.7% or more of GDP in ODA, in official development assistance, already referred to by Professor Kannan. However, with the current revision of the MDG framework, we have to also look at the picture of development and the role that official development plays in it. There's a broader picture to be made, and that broader picture was already sketched by my colleagues. In my contribution today, I'll focus on what has worked in our view and where there are gaps, and I'll give some ideas for the agenda post-2015. And I think in the background, we see that the why, the what, and the how of development are changing. Some countries are growing very fast, even though some maintain very substantial poverty levels, and the issue of inequality, already referred to, is coming to the fore much more. Some conflict-ridden countries remain desperately poor with challenges of security and governance. And many countries face problems that require global or regional solutions, whether it be climate change, crime, and insecurity or disease. Look, for instance, at small island states, which are, of course, suffering from climate-related rising sea levels. As the high-level panel that the Secretary-General has appointed and that Mr. Vos already referred to drafts an agenda, it needs to take into account these challenges as a response is being drafted to development challenges and global problems. And we agree very much with the recommendation that the Dutch Advisory Council on International Affairs made in its report on the post-2015 agenda, saying that the formulation of this agenda should be participatory, and not one that is purely led by governments. So we'll engage in this discussion quite constructively, but we'll also be there to listen. Now, on the current MDG framework, a lot has been said about it already. I'd like to actually look at what the former Secretary-General Kofi Annan said in his recent book, Interventions, which, by the way, I think is a very worthwhile book to read. He said that the MDGs put the individual at the heart of the agenda, which is very much like what Rob Vos already said. And according to Annan, the MDGs transformed the international agenda and brought poverty to the forefront. They provided for accountability and comparison, and they brought everyone to sing from the same song sheet. And we very much agree with that view. It has been a mobilization tool. It has provided time-bound specific accountability and comparison, and it helped establish a globally accepted narrative for development. They proved to be a mobilization tool for finance. I was involved in the Monterey Conference of 2002, where substantial increases were made in development assistance, but where also the narrative was that it wasn't just about development assistance. It was also about domestic resource mobilization, trade, investment, and debt. And I do think the common narrative is something to remember, in the sense that we should all remember the discussions on structural adjustment versus adjustment with the human face. Things have gotten a lot quieter on that front, even though Professor Kannan is, of course, rightly saying that all disagreements have not disappeared. When I was at the World Bank, I remember the day that Michel Camdessou had small cards with the MDGs distributed to everyone at his staff. Of course, the World Bank had to follow suit, so a week later there was a big banner in the World Bank atrium displaying the MDGs. It shows how fast things can go, because there was only a 2-year difference between major policy discussions and a lot more consensus. So those are the good things about the MDG agenda, but some challenges and gaps are apparent now as well. First of all, the MDGs have to be applied to country-specific situations, and the exact means are not implied. My former boss, Mark Malloch-Brown, the former Deputy Secretary General of the UN, wrote that the MDGs lay out minimum basic outcomes, but not the means of achieving them. For some countries, achieving the goals is much harder than for others. It all depends on the starting point. And to some extent, the MDGs are the canary in the coal mine. To achieve them, so much more must be done than to focus on them alone. Synergies must be achieved in development policy. And Charles Kenny, in his book Getting Better, focuses on the evolution of development prescriptions and talks about a focus on money, a focus on investment first, a focus on human capital, then a focus on policy reform, and in the end, institutional reform. And I think it's been said that the MDGs are the tip of the iceberg, the indicator of a healthy society, but you need to do a lot more in order to make sure they are achieved. The second point is what I already referred to, the disparity of progress between countries and within countries. Especially in fragile states, little progress has been achieved, but also disenfranchised and particularly vulnerable groups have not made as much progress. And that is very much related to the third point, which is basically the missing points on the agenda, which were mentioned earlier as well: sustainability, human rights, and accountability. Last but not least, the MDG framework does not sufficiently address drivers of economic development, the structural issues that were mentioned, including the role of the private sector and the financial flows beyond official development assistance. And this, in our view, addressing this agenda also means taking very seriously the agenda of financial inclusion. Her Royal Highness Princess Maxima has an official UN mandate to look at these issues, and looking at issues as microcredit, but also microfinance and insurance, the access basically to financial services of the poor, which could help them escape poverty. As Abhijit Banerjee and Esther Duflo wrote in Poor Economics, aid is only a very small part of the money that is spent on the poor every year. Those other resources should be made to work against poverty as well. So what elements are needed in the future development agenda? We want an agenda that enables countries to become equal partners at the global level. And because there's more diversity between countries, that means a pretty diverse agenda. This means that the overarching relationship between development partners will not be based just on official development assistance, but will gradually move to partnerships based on mutual benefit. The new agenda should strike a balance between the social, economic, and environmental pillars of sustainable development, and link up with the Rio +20 process that was already referred to. Also, we would like to add a fourth pillar. I think Rob Vos said it should be circles. I don't care about the exact terminology on peace, security, and rights. The position of fragile states deserves special attention, since none of them will achieve the MDGs. I co-chaired a process that led in Busan last year to a new deal for fragile states. I co-chaired that with the Minister of Finance of East Timor. And this is an agenda for fragile states which addresses issues such as jobs, such as justice and security. And those are, of course, very important issues, as are issues of combating aid volatility, having a long-term aid relationship with fragile states, and not ignoring the government. I think what Professor Kannan mentioned, that the Minister of Cambodia says only 15% of resources goes through the government, that is probably what he meant, and probably the other 85% went through NGOs. Well, that is something where we have to probably rebalance the agenda.
15% the country got it.
Okay, so good issue for discussion later on. And third, we feel that a new agenda should find a way to combine a focus on poverty eradication, and not having poverty but getting to zero, with a focus on global public goods and sustainable growth, security and rule of law issues. The framework could maintain a people-focused goals, and also look at sustainable development goals and focus on national and international enablers. I thought that was something very interesting that Rob Vos said. And the framework could, like in 2000, have two parts. A political declaration with principles that are important yet difficult to measure, and an operational part with clearly measurable goals and indicators. How should the new agenda be resourced? Globally, the importance of new actors, such as non-traditional donor countries and the private sector in development, is increasing. Foreign direct investment, remittances, and other external flows were already mentioned. Domestic resource mobilization, a very important part of development. The discussion of a post-2015 development agenda offers a good opportunity to involve these new actors in the elaboration of a framework that captures traditional development assistance, external financing flows, and all other contributions to development, basically building on the approach that was developed in Monterey. Many of these flows do not meet the conditions for official development assistance, but they are very relevant to development. We think that the overall ODA framework, official development assistance framework, is in need of revision by taking these flows into consideration. And that is the how of how we are going to get to the new agenda. This has to be a very important part of it, encompassing broader partnerships and alternative flows of knowledge and finance. After all, more resources should be crowded into developing countries. In some countries, such as fragile states, that will not be very easy because people will not want to invest there. But if you blend official development assistance and other resources, perhaps you can make a difference. We've seen good examples of that. The possibilities of innovative financing through public-private partnerships, solidarity mechanisms, or catalytic mechanisms should also be explored. As Bill Gates wrote to the G20 in 2011 in a report on development, we can create a hospitable, enabling environment and develop creative incentives to encourage the private sector to engage more deeply on development challenges. The new actors are fortunately also included on the panel. I think the high-level panel that the Secretary General has selected is very diverse. It has a better gender balance than this panel on the podium here. And it includes Betty Maina, who is chair of the Kenyan Association of Manufacturers, and Paul Polman, a very visionary CEO of Unilever. So what are some of the challenges that remain with this new agenda? Well, first of all, a Christmas tree might be hard to avoid. We have a lot of issues, of course, vying for attention. I remember vividly after the MDG agenda was set up with 8 goals that there were plenty of suggestions for goal number 9, 10 through 115. So clear global choices will have to be made on the what in order to make the how achievable. Second, the positive aspects of the current framework should be maintained. We cannot throw out the baby with the bathwater. Our aim should be to tackle the global challenges of our time, including prominently, of course, eliminating poverty. And third, the agenda should be comprehensive. There should be full coordination, and that, by the way, is very contrary to the issue of limitation, so it will be incredibly hard. But there should be full coordination with the follow-up of Rio +20, the Sustainable Development Goals, but also with the agenda of Cairo on reproductive health and rights and Beijing on women's rights. The anniversaries of both conferences are coming up, and it would be a waste not to include these issues in this process. The Netherlands will eagerly participate in the post-2015 agenda discussions, and we hope we will all do so. Will we jointly be able to ambitiously get to zero on poverty eradication? What will be our time horizon? Mr. Davidse rightly raised that point. Will the new agenda bring the contributions from civil society, the private sector, and governments together? We definitely hope so, and we hope that the new agenda will prove up to the challenges we will face at the global, regional, and national level. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Again, some bold statements on new actors, and again, hold your fire. We're now going back to the field again. Will is going to guide us again to some observations from our alumni.
Yes, indeed. Now, behind the table, we've coordinated that we will do only the second of the 2 videos, which is about the question whether it's still useful to have Millennium Development Goals or a new incarnation of such goals, or maybe we need very different goals altogether.
Some persons are skeptical about the Millennium Development Goals. The most common is that there is a general consensus that the goals will not be achieved in 2015 because they are unrealistic or not feasible, since they did not drive national strategies intending to reach them. Most countries did not incorporate these goals into their development strategies. This is the major reason for concern. This is a political issue.
The first thing is, I think what we really need to understand is that countries across the world, particularly developing countries across the world, have problems which are very different. Each country has its own problem. And in terms of areas of poverty that are affecting these countries or lack of development, the parameters are all very different. But what we need is some kind of rating scales that would measure the degree to which a country has progressed. And these rating scales, just off the cuff, could be in different areas. Like it could be in the matter of legislation. It could be in the matter of the availability of state machinery to adequately deal with the problem. It could be in the matter of proper orientation to state policy. It could be in the, opportunity given for infrastructure. Infrastructure in the sense of training, infrastructure for implementation, infrastructure for research. Each one of these things could all be put together in some form of a rating scale.
Due to the financial crisis, new economies' evolution as India, China, and Brazil, being Costa Rica a middle-income country, and current country challenges that remain, we are aware that it is time to rethink what we should be the next step or development model for our country, especially because there is still poverty concentration in middle-income countries like ours, what is known as the middle-income trap.
Moreover, the rising globalization, the financial crisis, and its effects on the economies, the weaknesses of the rules of governance, the demographic trends, the risks of human insecurity in fragile states, national resources and food insecurity, all these issues should deserve closer attention of international organizations, and development goals should adequately be revised to take account of dual changes. This has been done, that's right, but should have a more evident impact on national development strategies and to be less donors driven as it has been to now.
In the year 2009, the country initiated a long-term planning process facing the bicentennial commemoration of the independence of the Republic of Costa Rica at 2021, which has been called 2030 Costa Rica Vision.
The first one I want to mention here is breaking down goals into actionable points. For example, if one had to say, one would look at, say, something like abolition of poverty or hunger, then do these countries, do they have proper midday meal program for the poorest of the poor, or even parts of the country?
Ideally, development goals should have more qualitative dimensions. Not enough emphasis is devoted to human rights and social rights. Development goals should be more addressed to the causes and not only to the results as they are now. For example, there is no emphasis on the structural changes required to growth and development. No reference or little reference is made to sustainable economic growth and employment as objectives. No attention is devoted to within countries inequality. Wider academic and political debate is required with more economic theory on it.
This 2030 long-term vision replicates the methodology used for the Millennium Development Goals and also traces a path model for the desired future development of Costa Rica beyond 2021. It is a process of deliberation and generation of national agreements, what we can call national consensus, defining key themes or subject areas for the type of country and development we want to aspire.
Thank you very much for your attention. Now it's the time for the others. The minority has been spoken here. Now we give floor to the majority. We have about half an hour for discussion, and then I will ask the panel to react every person 5 minutes on the reactions in the floor, and Wilhout will guiding us in the answering the questions by walking around. So I'm going to look first at the left. Are there any questions? Has this?
To the right.
Then we go to the right. There we have one question. You.
Okay, maybe you could state your name.
Yeah.
I would like to hold the microphone.
That is fine. That is fine. Hello, my name is Gabi Spitz. I'm a researcher at NCDO, and I think it is for us more or less easy to think about what the post-MDG framework should look like, because we have all have our ideals. We know what the problems are. But when you look at the time frame in which the MDGs were set, it was a very positive time. It was before 9/11. It was before the financial crisis. So those days were very different from the time now. And I'm wondering, how feasible is it in this international times, in these difficult times that we are going through also diplomatically? You see that Rio+20 was unsatisfying, and a lot of other UN summits were as well. How feasible is it that we will reach new goals?
Thank you.
Come to you in a second.
My name is Ting, and I'm a new PhD student of ISS. And as a former UN staff, I want to also ask a question, maybe for those UN colleagues who are still working in UN China in Beijing. And let alone the MDGs we are discussing today, but how to maintain the stability of UN itself. And for example, in terms of financial sustainability, what kind of constraints and limits, which is like bounding the recruitment and for example, the career of UN staff. And I could give you example. For example, the UN ODC office in China now, as I don't know, when I resigned, it's still there, but I heard it's going to be withdrawn from China because of various reasons, and also like the changing role of WFP, and with the changing role of WFP and some staff, they may feel insecure of their job. So in this regard, I think to realize MDGs, the UN itself needs to secure the staff and to make them, more motivated and feel more committed to the job itself. So regarding this kind of issue, any current discussion going on, that's my concern.
Okay, thank you. So MDGs for UN staff, huh? So it's, Jan Breeman.
I'm here.
Yeah.
Very good.
You want to stand or you sit?
Do you want me to stand up, or I can stand up? No problem. We are discussing not only the MDGs and what can be done at the global level, but we also are discussing the agenda of the ISS, isn't it, in the years to come. And basically I have listened to two types of presentations, and with all appreciation for what has been said. The one is more or less a public relations exercise, I would say. A public relations exercise believing in the MDG and also believing in the post-MDG world. And I would like to refer you to a man who was in the policy, in the realm of policies then, and who later joined the ISS. I mean Jan Pronk. When he became a staff member of ISS, he wrote a book, a very interesting book, in which he said, I have been betrayed, I have been cheated. It was never serious, the MDGs. They have never meant it. It was for a photo session, and that was it. I think more policymakers should write their biographies. I think that's important, because we have, as academicians, as from the scholarly point of view, we have to understand their way of thinking. And he is a good figure coming up with why he feels betrayed why he feels cheated. I think that's important. And I would, as far as the agenda of the ISS is concerned, express the hope that the real world is being addressed, and not a make-believe world, not a world of wishful thinking, in which we project our aspirations, our assumptions, in a faraway future, on which we have no control, on which we have also no elements. And I would say that the ISS has a role not only to teach, but also to do research, and to do research in the real world. And that world is one in crisis at the moment. And I would like the curriculum of the ISS to be in the near future, to be revolved around the issues of crisis. Crisis far away, but also crisis at home. An understanding, a deconstruction of the process of globalization, which all what it means, and also its effects, its impact. And that has not much to do with public relations. Thank you very much.
Okay. And this, of course, was Jan Breeman, who is the most recent honorary fellow of the ISS.
Okay, thank you. And I hope that somebody from the ISS will react to your challenge and also explain the new research program, because I think in the new research program some of the elements you mentioned are already there, but I think somebody else is more apt to do that than I from the chair. So, next question I saw.
You must guide me there?
Yeah, there.
Okay.
Thank you. My name is Karen Sanchez. I'm a PhD researcher at ISS. I'm from Colombia. In the presentation of Professor Rob Vos, I read 3 times the expression inclusion. Social inclusion, economic inclusion, and related to that also the idea of policy coherence to the global, to the subnational level, all through. I think this is one of the main issues the new development agenda should address, because it's quite different from a view centered in poverty. What are the ideas and views and points regarding inclusion that are considering for this new agenda? And my next question is, it was really difficult to settle a national agenda for the MDGs. How do you think the world, the countries are going to achieve this policy coherence until the subnational level?
Okay, thank you very much. Let's speaker over there. And then I see 2 hands there already, and we'll continue. Yeah, I have Martin.
Could you stand up? Yeah. No. Yeah. My name is Wilbert van Heuvel. I'm a former UN official. I've worked mainly in Africa and Asia. I would like to make 2 points. No, 3 points. The first is, thank you very much.
If they're not too long, huh? Because this is also at the expense of the others.
The first point is very short. Thank you for all the introductions. They were extremely interesting. The second point is, I'm not a specialist in development, but it seems to me that this agenda, or the new agenda, the thinking about the new agenda, is huge, and a bit too huge. Full indeed of aspirations, as Professor Breeman, I think, just said, especially by including the dimension of peace and security, which is also extremely political, as we all know. So, to what extent is it actionable? Is it feasible? Is it concrete? And is it not too politicized? I think it's dangerous for the future of the agenda. And the third point, just a plea, a strong plea. Having made the previous point, I would like to make a plea to really give enough full attention to rule of law issues under the chapter of governance. I've seen in too many places, especially in states or countries in transition, how lack of a basic legal infrastructure and access to justice is hampering development and security.
Okay, thank you very much. We go over to this side. There was a lady there, and then 3 gentlemen behind her, besides her. Your name? Yeah.
Hi, yes, I'm Renike van Dam from CIMAVI, working in the area of sexual and reproductive health and rights. And thank you very much for mentioning Cairo Declaration and Beijing, which is very important also to bring forward in this discussion. My question is really about, you mentioned human rights in the agenda. I heard national sovereignty, especially in the area of human rights, gender equality. We found that it's quite problematic to address these issues and bring them forward in an international agenda. So how do you combine national sovereignty and maybe a broader agenda of human rights, and that can clash? How do you bring that forward?
So one of the reasons probably why human rights was not included in the first MDG. So that's have Martin and then 2 people.
Well, you don't need any introduction, but still introduce yourself.
Thank you. I'm Martin Durenbos. I've been working here for some time at the ISS. I was listening with great interest to what former colleague Rob Vos reported on the UN future agenda and the elements it would include. And first of all, I would like to agree with everything that is on that agenda. It looked very great. It's especially also if one breaks it down, it was, as you did, with social inclusiveness, economic inclusiveness, sustainability, environmental sustainability, and the peace and security things. And together, they reinforce each other, etc. So it's a beautiful picture. What bothers me is that the reality as we see it today, as we can read it today, every day in the newspapers, in scholarly journals, etc., is precisely the opposite. It goes not into inclusiveness, but into lessening of it, into more conflict than solving it, and so forth. And again, this is sort of reinforcing one another. So what I missed and I would have liked to see is just a little bit of a word on the how. How do you switch from this one transition that is being depicted as something for the future? How do you switch away from the current trends into that opposite kind of scenario? Thank you.
Thank you. Gentleman over there, and then the gentleman behind you.
Yes, my name is Gordon Crawford from the University of Leeds in the UK, and my question and remarks also about human rights, and wanting to ask the panel how they perceive the relationship between human rights and the MDGs in a new future development agenda, or the role of human rights in a future development agenda. Obviously, the relationship between human rights and the MDGs has been a controversial one, included in the original Millennium Declaration, but then absent from the goals as targets. If goals become rights rather than targets, then clearly their nature changes, their character changes. I would suggest that one advantage of rights is that it opens up the development agenda to being a bottom-up process involving sort of local political activism, whereas the MDGs as targets have been much more a top-down government-led process. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Gentleman behind you there.
Okay. Thank you very much. My name is Howard Onyok. I'm a master's student here at ISS. I come from Uganda. I would like to focus on the first discussant's point under inclusive human development, where he looks at the quality of education. My concern is, has the United Nations got a yardstick or a measure to measure how the quality of especially primary education is implemented in developing countries, because you realize that it's more or less of not quality, because if you have in a class 200 pupils to one teacher, the quality is completely eroded off. What is the way forward? Because then we are better off not being educated, because then an educated person can know what they want. I know I need a hospital, I know I need a road. What step is there? What is United Nations going to do with the governments to address this issue? Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Very important question on the quality, not only the quantity. Often goals are quantities rather than quality. A question over there? You walk a lot, Will. I think.
That's healthy.
It's good, thanks.
So that's my Millennium Development Goal for today. You were the first.
Of what?
Of the two here.
Oh, my name is Rob Vos. I'm working in ISS. And of course, I realize we are looking ahead beyond 2015. But I would still like to ask, isn't there any evidence on what has been achieved, in the MDGs? Because we don't really get that information. And there must have been patterns, like, it was said here that we don't have any idea what it would have been like without the MDGs, but that's a rather easy answer. So I would like to ask the panel.
You want to give it the answer now, and then the panel people can react to it, or?
No, but I would like the panel to get back to this and say, give some more evidence, whether there are patterns, fragile states, high inequality. Does it link to better achievement of the goals?
Okay, thank you. Gentlemen.
And you're the second.
Thank you so much. I'm John Leonard Ochom from Uganda as well, and a master's student here. I'm also concerned, almost related to that, how the UN is going to move from the MDGs to the current, actually the coming agenda after 2015. We have so much not achieved. We have so much still not okay in the ground. As long as achievement of the MDGs has gone, we're crossing to the next agenda. How are we going to look at what is remaining, our backlog we have? So in the transition, I think we have a lot still missing. We have so many lagging behind, and we may count very few ahead. How are we going to connect? Thank you.
Thank you. Other questions? Yes.
Yes, my name is Maurice Barnes. I'm an alumni from here, and I've lived in Uganda for the last 20 years. What I've seen in Uganda and many other parts of Africa I've been to is there been some success with Millennium Goals, but they're being totally undermined at the moment at a horrendous rate by a huge growth of inequalities in virtually all the countries I've been to, by the total destruction of the environment, by the population growing at an incredible rate. So now food security in a country like Uganda, which should be a breadbasket, is now becoming a major problem. And I really don't see how these cardinal problems, which are facing all of mankind, but particularly in Africa, can be tackled in a political environment where the global elite is now just craving for growth and resources, whether it's the Chinese or the Americans or indeed the Europeans, and where their endeavour really is to rape Africa and other countries in order to maintain this illusion of material growth in the rest of the world. And it seems to me that is really the message we're getting from most of our politicians, and it doesn't ring true with any way you can do anything for the rest of the world. And I don't see how these things are going to combine at all in any realistic way, or we're going to get what young Plonk gets, a nice bit of publicity, and we'll all get carried away, and Ugandans will get tied to these new things. And I have to say to Ugandans here, I've seen that. They're tied to the old Millennium Goals, but they're not looking at the underlying problems which have been affecting Uganda for a long time, through inequalities and huge corruption which comes from that. I could go on. But it's a sidetrack. It's been for me in Uganda for the last 10 years. A total sidetrack.
Yeah. Lost in translation, as one of our researchers called it in the ISS. Thank you. Are there any more questions? Yeah.
Leo has one.
Leo.
Okay, yeah. You get the last one.
Yeah. We always give our boss the last words.
Maybe the last, but not the final.
Thank you. My name is Marlies Hesselman. I'm a PhD researcher from the University of Groningen. Two very short questions, though perhaps a bit complex. The one relates to bringing in human rights into the MDG agenda or linking them in a way, and perhaps also the question that was asked over there. I was wondering, is there any idea on to what extent there is a relation between the goal on water being reached and the human right to water being recognized over the past decades? Is there any indication that one might have to do with the other? The second point that I would like to make concerns the issue of accountability. I think it was mentioned by a few of the speakers here today, and it's identified, I think, as an issue that could be better addressed in the post-2015 framework. Are there any thoughts on how that would work, though? Because it would be quite complex, I would say. Accountability could exist on different levels, national, international, especially when we bring in different actors, international organizations, NGOs, corporations. How would accountability work on all these fronts? And maybe a final comment. Would we gain something by bringing the language of responsibilities more into the MDG discussions as something that could spur action?
Okay, thank you. Very important point about accountability, because that's one of the selling points of the MDG. How do you achieve that? Leo Daan?
Thank you. You don't need to introduce yourself. I guess you did already.
Yeah, I would like to thank Jan Breeman for his challenge. Honorary doctors are not there to please us, but to challenge us. And so we've accepted that challenge, yes. I'm pleased to announce that we are in the process of establishing new research programs, 3 plus a new research initiative. And they actually focus on the environmental crisis, on the social justice crisis, on the poverty crisis, on the human rights crisis. That is what research is about at ISS. Good, sound, scientific research, but always in relation with development practice. And for the teaching program, the new batch of students has started a new, would you say, structure of the teaching program, organized in 5 majors now, again, in which all these issues return. And Jan Breeman knows, and also Jan Pronk knows, that ISS way of teaching is capitalizing on our students' experiences. And our students come from all over the world, and they bring in experiences from their professional careers. They are with their feet in the mud, as my colleagues researchers are. So yes, Jan, this is our task to bring this forward. But I think ISS also needs to create platforms like this, debates like this, in order to create tools, vehicles to bring that forward, and not to let happen that aspirations are only formalized or formulated to fool people. Thanks.
Okay, thank you. We have reached the end of the questions, or at least if there are more questions, they cannot be posed anymore because we have a time limit. Everything is scarce in life, also time. And I would like to ask the panel members to react now. There were many questions, but I think there were a few threads in the questions. First of all, posed by some of you and also by one of the presenters. Can the MDGs actually help in stemming the current process of financial globalization, growing inequality, poverty? Can the MDGs or the UN be a tool to that? What is the role of politics? Then we had a lot of questions on the way the MDGs are organized, how they are formulated, the relation to human rights, the relation to human security. And then we also had the intervention on how a national government should deal with this MDG. So we have quite a number of clusters of questions. I will ask every panel member to spend 5 minutes on answering that, and we'll do it in the same order as the presentation. So, Professor Vos, 5 minutes and not one more.
Thank you. If I could answer in 5 minutes all the big questions were posed, I probably could go and collect the Nobel Prize for Economics on Friday. So let me just pick and choose some of the questions that were raised and well, give some thoughts about it. Probably not fully answer all of those that were raised. Let me start first with the comments, maybe even more than a question, was raised by Jan Breeman on is this not a nice PR story and are you realistic? So he framed it in a question towards the ISS, but I guess it's the same to us at the UN. Well, is it A PR story? No, I hope not. It's trying to be built on the realities we see out there and that need to be addressed. Raising the question, did the MDG agenda address them in full? The answer to that, and in the thinking about post-2015, no, they did not. So a lot of the thinking that went in before getting to this proposed new framework, which is a very rudimentary framework, needs to be elaborated further, is how can we address these recurrent crises? These crises that are very strongly interlinked, financial, food, energy, environmental crises, and which are not just at the national level, but are global problems. So the reason to think, to justify, we do need to think forward into a much stronger international agenda is precisely to address those questions. Now, can we do it? And can we define the agenda in a realistic way? That's the challenge, I think, moving forward. But if we're not ambitious, then we won't get to an agenda of change. Then if we're just realistic, and some people argue that the MDGs, the way the targets were set deliberately in a realistic and achievable way, were also a source of critique, saying, well, you're not ambitious enough, right? So I think that moving forward to change these things, there's a need for transformative change, and we have to bring things together. And the agenda setting can help do that. And things change rapidly. When I asked the Committee for Development Policy, which is a UN Committee of Experts, of which your colleague Hans Opschoor is still one of the members and was founded by Jan Timbergen at the time, when they wrote the first report in 2007, right, that's only 5 years ago, on climate change and development, and brought it to the Economic and Social Council of the United Nations, many members of the Economic and Social Council said, this is not our agenda. Right? That should be somewhere with the UNFCCC on climate change, but on the economic and social issues, that's not there. Now, all that discourse has changed and say, well, this is at the heart of our discussion, and in Rio Plus 20, we did the same. So I would certainly encourage, and I think Leo has also already responded to that, is the research agenda should go in that direction. And I guess also in the agenda setting, moving forward, that could help us sharpen the vision moving forward. So that's a long answer to that part of the question. Now, some other important questions we raised, and Rolf won't allow me to speak too long, but let me first address the issue of human rights and the agenda, and also the MDG agenda. It depends on how you look at human rights in the first place. I would say that it's not that the MDG agenda excluded human rights. If you see poverty reduction, right to education, right to health, and so on, as human rights, then they are part of that agenda. Maybe the more political side of it, and defending also legal human rights, that, yes, that was included. But from that perspective, and that's the way we've tried to frame it, it's, we see human rights as a cross-cutting issue that has to be embedded in all policymaking to make sure is that in your economic and social policies, also in how you define your environmental policies, that human rights should be part of the story. That's why we said, well, in the values that underpin the overall agenda, human rights should be the first and foremost principle that should be adhered to. Now, there's more to be said to that, but I don't get the time to elaborate on that. But I think that is an important point to stress. Then allow me to address two more issues. I take from here and leave the others to answer the other ones. I think the question was raised on inclusion and coherence in the agenda. Well, I think that's critical. So one of the critiques of the MDG agenda was too much focused on reducing poverty and in absolute ways provide people with access to education and health. So that does address issues of inequalities and ensure inclusion if you are able to provide all of them with that access. But it was not embedded throughout the agenda. So that's why it's put to the fore in the proposed new framework for the agenda. But because of all these things hanging together, policy coherence will have to be critical moving forward. Well, now, what that means, it's a nice word. Nobody's against coherence, because who likes to be incoherent? But the issue is, how would you do that? And I think at all levels, also in this country, at the European Union, when I made some presentations for the European Parliament and also for the European Commission, they sent me to talk to particularly the development cooperation experts. And after talking, they actually said, well, maybe we're the wrong people you should be talking to, because if we don't include the finance ministers, the environmental ministers, the social development ministers, then this kind of agenda won't be moving forward. Well, then I put the question back to them, so how you think of doing that and putting things together, because you're the actors that have to do that. That all has to be shaped, but what we propose in the framework is to work with principles that work across the different areas, that define how one would, as I said, as an example in my presentation, how would you achieve food security? Is that just a matter of agricultural ministers and agricultural development and improving food distribution systems? Or is that a much broader question? The answer to that is it's a much broader question that needs to run across several areas of policy making, and not just national policy making. Food security is not something you can achieve at the national level unless you believe that all countries should move towards food autarky, which I guess is not something that most would propose. So we have to find ways to change the global food chain so that we can get to sustainable food security. Probably my 5 minutes up. I'm going to say more things about finance, but if you allow me, I'll say more.
If you have a magic solution to finance, then...
No, I think because to connect a few dots, of course, people are concerned that maybe aid effectiveness and the amounts of aids have not been adequate to serve the purpose. But the challenges that we see is something where the existing aid architecture is completely deficient to resolve. It's not just the amounts of money. So if we think of transformative change towards sustainable development, that will require, if we just think of also needs for new investments in developing countries, a multifold of the present volumes of aid. I can recommend some of our previous reports that actually make several estimates of what would be needed. But also if you think of in terms of global public goods, and the fact that, particularly if you think of sustainable development, that's not something that's only needs where developing countries have to be facilitated and assisted in achieving those goals, but also which are part of a more global agenda, then why would the aid architecture or the international financial architecture for development need to be continued to be based on the incentives to national taxpayers in donor countries to pay up for it? So we have other actors there, but I think also you have to think of international forms of mobilization of resources, which would match meeting the needs of global public goods. But also you have to rethink the international financial architecture. The reference was made about, Professor Kannan also referred to that the debt service payments are multifold of aid flows. But maybe the number more to the point is that developing countries altogether added 1 trillion in US dollars to their reserves, a little bit, even leave a little more than 1 trillion to reserves, which is all money invested in the US and other developed countries. What it says is that if we don't rethink also the international financial architecture and also think of international financial stability as part of the global public goods that should provide the enabling environment for development, then we may not achieve and may not be able to put us on the road to a changed global development that's more sustainable and more inclusive. So those are some headlines. I'm sorry I didn't answer all the questions, but
no, you were not asked to, but to give.
Yeah, thank you.
Professor Kannan, I think, could lead in from Rob on some of the issues.
Yeah, okay, I have a bad throat, so I'll be less than 5 minutes. No, my take is slightly different in the sense that I think although there were not specific questions addressed to me, I believe most of the questions raised doubts about the legitimacy, feasibility, and non-inclusion of very important principles like human rights, gender equality, national sovereignty, and so forth. So basically there is an unease. There is an unease in which the way development agenda is being pushed forward. Not just the inadequacy of MDG type, but also the overall approach to that. My first answer would be, I think UN has increased in the number of member countries, but it has lost considerably in its prestige and credibility over a period of time. Just go back to the first decade of the formation of the United Nations. Those wonderful reports, 3 major reports were commissioned, and that became the basis for international development strategy, policies, creation of GATT and Bretton Woods and a whole range of things. And these are, one, the first report, and I want to underline the title, Measures for Full Employment. Measures for full employment. I didn't hear a word on employment in all these that we are talking, either in the current MDG agenda or in what could be a future agenda. The second one specifically addressed to the then poor countries, chaired by none other than Arthur Lewis, measures for economic development. And the third one, measures for international economic stability. These were the three pioneering reports which laid the foundation for the UN to play a very big role in the reconstruction, development, peace, and disarmament agenda. I think this is now a setback, and we have gone backwards and trying to take refuge in very limited targeting of a few things. It's not that infant mortality should not be reduced. Of course, infant mortality should be reduced. But we have gone back to a very narrowly conceived and narrowly defined agenda from those earlier times when we wanted to have an international effort with all the member countries involved in it. And that loss of spirit and that loss of vision and that lot of leadership, I think, is another sign of the crisis that Jan talked about that we are facing today. The second point I want to make is that, and which I also made in my presentation, is that how can we talk about the development agenda? And I suppose you all agree with me when I say development is not just economic growth. If that is the thing, then we just go back to the growth agenda. Development is much more than growth. But what is the Bretton Woods institutions insist on poorer countries, and now not so poorer countries through IMF, in the name of fiscal consolidation, in the name of fiscal discipline. It has nothing to do with the development agenda. So all the money, the donor countries, money is channeled through these two powerful multilateral financial institutions. But all the free advice is channeled through the United Nations system. So United Nations system have very good people, very good platforms, and debates, and I think it's very important we need to talk. We need to talk more and more and not to bomb more and more. And I think we need to talk, but not backed by any money. There is no UN special fund for this kind of development. So they can give advice, but without any backing. But the power is where the money is. So the entire agenda gets shifted. So they they also appropriate some of this agenda. Now, if you look at the World Bank and IMF, all the talks and the work that they did in ILO in the 80s are now being appropriated in the name of basic needs and inclusion and a whole range of things. I think that's a very important thing. The third one I want to just stress or share with you is, first of all, I don't know whether there is any meaning in clubbing together all the countries, even within the developing countries, and talk about a development agenda. Just pick out countries that are in conflict, either because of internal reasons or because of external reasons or a combination of internal and external reasons. Do they have the time, resources, the capacity to think about development goals when the people are trying to survive? In Iraq, you had a middle-income country with very decent levels of standard of living by MDG standards. They were bombed back how many decades, I don't know. And now sectarian violence is rife. What is the meaning when you go and talk to the Iraq government that you must now have a new development agenda? Or in Afghanistan, for example, when the drones are roaming around you and the poor women and children get killed in their marriage parties or when they go and fetch water, what kind of development agenda are they going to sell to those countries? Or Somalia, hardly any state there, and the youth become pirates, and they do what they know best to survive. So the entire, I think the whole crisis also is engulfing a set of countries who are in conflict in one way or another. The second set of countries, I think mention has been made here of some countries because of sheer internal reasons and dynamics, the rent-seeking behavior, if I may put it, or the predatory character of the ruling elite in many of the countries, and not just in Africa, I suppose. There are also other examples, but maybe some regional concentrations are there. Or do you think they will take this development agenda seriously? So there's a deep political economy crisis in those countries, and the inequality that it generates. So that's why I said finance is not the problem. And third set of countries who may have done reasonably well, whether China or India or Indonesia or Southeast Asian countries and all. But mind you, these economies have been experiencing a trend rate of growth of more than 6% for the last 30 years. Yes, they have reduced their absolute levels of poverty, but look at the inequality figures now. China is now one of the most unequal countries in the world, China. And we are not far behind. We want to catch up with China on everything. But in this thing, we would catch up much better because the Gini coefficient, I'm telling you empirically, from 0.3 to 0.39. And China is what, 4 or 5?
5.
Oh, well, look close to 5. That's unimaginable. There are only few countries you can imagine 5 or above 5. So inequality is something which can happen only, and in growing economies, only when the wealth is going to a few and the majority are deprived. So there again, finance is not the problem. So unless we take that into consideration, and I think the United Nations deliberates on it. In social science, we won't get a unified theory as in science, or even there, I think I'm told it's very difficult, but we need to have some kind of larger perspective and has to place the whole issue of crisis. And I think that's where, from an academic point of view, I think this is something as scholars, as academics, we need to address constantly. Of course, I don't have to tell Rolf, he's working on inequality and employment and all those kinds of things. But I think if you don't do that, I think they will not be really worth our salt. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Koen.
Well, thank you. Only a few questions left. I will go through some of them. Thank you very much for these very good comments. On the question of from Javi Smits whether the agenda is feasible, I think it's going to be hard, but I think we don't have a choice but to try. And I do think, as Rob Vos already indicated, there are several elements which make me optimistic. First of all, this is a long-term agenda, so it's not an agenda of what we have to achieve tomorrow, if only we could. Secondly, the issue of reform of architecture, I think that is very important. It's not just about more volume of money, but it's also about how we spend it. A third point, the crowding in of other forces, making the private sector, making trade, making debt relief, making domestic resource mobilization count. So I do think there are a lot of things we can do. The Secretary General did the right thing by having a very diverse panel. He could have chosen a very small panel which would have agreed easily, but he's chosen a bigger one, which means that hopefully they'll be able to create a platform. Ting, you asked a question about the future of the UN's financial sustainability. I can only say, I've just came from New York, that the issues you raise about contracts and so on are very well known. The Secretary General is working on reforms which are actually, they don't look ambitious, but they're ambitious on this. But it's going to take, it's going to be very hard, because I think donor countries, including us, unfortunately, are pushing hard for the UN to cut costs. And there the problem is that in middle income countries, of course, there's often a strong tendency to say the UN shouldn't be there, and there has to be sort of a transition phase. But I think it is a problem because the UN, especially young people at the UN, are employed on shorter term contracts, it seems, every year, and that makes it very hard for the UN to renew itself. So it's definitely a problem that deserves attention. On Jan Breeman's issue of whether this is a PR exercise, I think the MDGs have provided a mirror that is very relevant. It provided information we should know. It provided an impetus to countries to work on statistics and to really know what was going on, and not just on easy issues, but also on tougher issues such as gender. I do think there is a tendency sometimes, and that refers to the debate between Sachs and Easterly, of a technification of the development debate. And there are many underlying issues which are political and which cannot be ignored. I do see also, I have seen, when I worked at the World Bank and the UN, I've seen a real convergence in terms of what people are looking at. The fact that the most recent World Development Reports of the World Bank are about fragile states, jobs, and gender. When I was at the bank, that was not possible, and these issues were raised by people, including myself. And the fact that Jim Kim is now the president of the World Bank is also something that wouldn't have happened 10 years ago. Karen Sanchez raised the issue of inclusion, and I think that is a very powerful word. The New Deal agenda on fragile states that I mentioned has inclusion at its core. Dealing with issues of inequality and fault lines, at least for fragile states, is at the heart of the challenge, and I think we have a responsibility as donors. I was Director of Peace Building before, to take responsibility and look at our aid programs. How are we contributing to divisions within societies, or are we helping to basically create more inclusion? Mr. van der Heuvel asked whether peace and security, whether that's not too political to raise it within the MDG agenda, and then you raised the not so political, apparently, issue of the rule of law. So I do think these are unavoidable issues. The fact that the Fragile States agenda I just spoke about was raised by developing countries. It was raised by Afghanistan, by Liberia. They know that this is an issue. They know that this has to be addressed. But it's not going, it doesn't make it easy issues to deal with, but these issues definitely are part of a national and hopefully also of an international agenda. Then several people, Gordon Crawford, Ms. Van Dam, Marlies Hesselman, raised the issue of human rights. I do think on the sovereignty versus human rights issue, most national laws in the world have human rights in there. So definitely there are sovereignty issues. Definitely governments are in charge of territories, but they also have their own laws to abide to. And there's a couple of international treaties they signed up to. So I do think it's an issue that can be discussed. That at least is the view of my government. On human rights and the MDGs, I do think some principles are very hard to put into indicators or numbers, and you should be careful not to trivialize them by making it too narrow. But there are definitely issues on the rule of law and on security that can be put into indicators. Within that process on fragile states, we looked at access to justice indicators. We looked at violence indicators, which also have as an interesting effect. If you look at violent deaths, for instance, the map of the world looks quite different. If you look at the number of violent deaths in Mexico, for instance, and compare it to Afghanistan, those are scary statistics, and they create a different image, because I think Professor Kannan said it rightly, that we need to think a bit differently about the map of the world. It's no longer north versus south. It's much more difficult and much more complicated. So I do think that that's a very important point to make. Howard Neuk raised the quality of education. I do think that is something where the MDG agenda really pushed us probably into a quantity direction. And I think there's reports, evaluation reports, including in our own system, that indicate that quality should be much more on the agenda. And it's definitely something that needs more attention. The final point that I really, I was struck by the intervention, I think, of Morris Vance on Uganda. It's clear that this agenda doesn't cover everything. It's clear that a national agenda doesn't cover everything. I have a lot of experience with Sudan, which also sometimes, the issues are so big, how are you going to address them? And one thing I take from this is that, yes, this new agenda is not going to cover all of these issues. And there are a lot of underlying problems that should not be ignored. And that's what I meant when I say don't just treat this as a technical debate. In the end, there are a lot of political forces that need to be taken into consideration. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. I would like to thank all the participants. Hold your breath. I first like to have Maria. Maria has been our backbone. Without Maria, this conference was not possible. Neither was it like Wart Wammerdam. A big round of applause for Maria and Wart, who have been working for this conference. And I now give the floor to Maria.
But the chair didn't respond to any questions.
He will do another seminar. These are some tokens for our forum. And I would like to thank everybody. We had a debate. The debate is not over, as you could see. In the second round, there were still diverging opinions, but I think that's important in this debate. But the important thing about the post-2015 agenda is that there's an inclusive process where different opinions are aired and where different positions are made much clearer than it was in the earlier break. Before we close, one announcement. There will be an opening of an art exhibition in 2-3 minutes. In this room. You're all welcome to stay. If you think I have been thirsty so much already, you can already go upstairs for a drink. Afterwards, the people of the art exhibition, thank you, will also come upstairs. So it's up to you. You can either stay here and stay for another 10 minutes to look at the opening of the art exhibition. If you say, well, I don't like art, or I'm so thirsty, I've been listening to, you can already go for drinks. It's up to you. You have the choice. Thank you very much. You were a wonderful audience, and thank everybody. Bye.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Ralph, for a wonderful